What's going on YouTube? It's Teach, back again with another video. And today we're going to have a little bit of fun and poke some fun at myself and go back and look at my way too early 2023 NFL mock. Which, the point of these videos, which by the way, we're going to do one tomorrow for a way too early 2024 mock. It's really just to diagnose some names who might be in that first round conversation. But, with a year's time, a lot of these takes and fits and player destinations look terrible. So it's a little bit of fun I can get to poke at myself. And then again, tomorrow we're going to dive into my way too early 2024 mock. Another fun, kind of component of this video is where Vegas thought the draft order was going to be at. I always have a good time looking at where we maybe thought, these bad teams were going to be that end up being a lot better, or teams that we thought could be like playoff contenders that end up picking in the top 10. But with all that said, let's go ahead and jump right into it. And they had Atlanta at pick number 1, which is kind of fun. They don't end up picking that high, but they end up taking, or I end up giving them Will Anderson. Which, hey, I mean, if he made it all the way down to 8, plenty of Falcons fans would have been over the moon about that, but he does not. But Will Anderson was that kind of prospect that we were talking about that early on in the process that could be a number 1 overall pick or could be one of the blue chippers that goes in the top 3, and that ended up being the case. He just did not go to Atlanta, and Atlanta was better than what we thought, so they ended up picking at 8. So not too crazy of a start there. Bryce Young goes number 2 overall to Houston, which Bryce Young ends up being the first quarterback off the board, just at number 1 overall. Houston does end up taking a quarterback at 2, so again, not a take that was terribly far off at the time. And actually, if my memory serves, the next pick is C.J. Stroud, and that it was going to Detroit, who skips quarterback in the first round at least, but then they add that position in day 3, or round 3, I beg your pardon, with Hendon Hooker, and that feels like a nice continuation at the worst of what you have with Jared Goff, just at a much cheaper price point, which is good for the rest of the roster. But yeah, I thought that maybe this would be the time for them to move on from Goff, and I said multiple times that Stroud kind of reminds me of Goff with more mobility, so this would have been kind of a fun fit, but I think the other intriguing element about this, you have Detroit here at 3, Seattle then at 4, and Vegas with the odds that kind of accumulated this draft order. They thought that would be Detroit's pick and Seattle's pick. Instead, it's Seattle picking at 5, courtesy of the Broncos, and then it's the Lions picking at 6, thanks to the Rams. So it's interesting that they ended up picking close to where they were in this mock, but not with the picks that we thought it would be. So that's kind of a fun thing to look back and poke some fun at with Vegas and their odds. But they did not go quarterback at 3. Instead, they ended up going with a trade back from 6 to 12 and taking Jahmyr Gibbs. But I probably would have liked the C.J. Stroud pick more, but they didn't have the chance to take Stroud. And Stroud goes top 3. He's the second quarterback off the board. That take didn't age too poorly. Then we get Jalen Carter at 4 to Seattle. There was a lot of smoke that they could go Carter at 5. They ended up going Witherspoon, so it sounded like kind of a smoke screen. But the fit would have made a lot of sense, and I would have liked it if they did make that pick at 5. They just go with Witherspoon instead and keep addressing that secondary, keep loading it up with talent. And, avoid maybe the immaturity concerns that people have with Carter. But yeah, again, Seattle did pick nearly this in this spot, but it was thanks to the Rams. So that's always, again, fun to kind of look back on. But Carter did end up being a top 9 pick and, easily could have been taken even higher than what he was. But still, if not for the immaturity concerns and the 2 misdemeanors, he might have even gone higher than 9, and maybe would have gone that high. And then this was the pick. I remember this one. You would have thought I had murdered Santa Claus after I made this selection. Jets fans wanted to come for me after they had just signed C.J. Uzomah and Tyler Conklin. So it was like, tight end's not a need. And, my argument at the time was, well, Eric Gilbert's kind of a potential Kyle Pitts-ish player where he could play wide receiver, he can play tight end, the Jets could use another playmaker, and Gilbert could be that. Gilbert ends up not being a top 5 pick, and of course the Jets don't even pick this high, and they don't go tight end until the 7th round with Zach Kuhn. So, a lot of things here were wrong. Again, that's kind of the whole fun and the humorous point of this video. But again, you would have thought I had killed Santa Claus on 34th Street in broad daylight with this mock selection. But of course, Gilbert, not this guy. Jets don't pick this high. Instead, they're picking at 15, and they go with a different direction. So yeah, this one was pretty far off. All right, next, then it is the Jags taking Kayshon Boutte, which that's funny to think about. He did have the potential to be wide receiver 1, because of what we saw in the 6 games he played in, 2021. But the injuries kind of play a factor. He didn't get along with Brian Kelly. That whole drama with him at LSU was a little rough. So he falls all the way to the 6th round. And if there was one spot for me to get kind of reinvested into Keishon Butte, it was him going to New England, and that he did. But yeah, definitely wasn't going top 6. And of course, the Jags end up winning the AFC South. They don't pick anywhere near as high as they did in this way too early mock. And then Tanner McKee to Carolina. I just love that I've been consistently so high on Tanner McKee, which, there's a handful of people that like McKee, but broad consensus, he was not somebody that a lot of people loved. And, I thought Philadelphia had the best draft, so I feel kind of affirmed by liking Tanner McKee if the Eagles selected him. Now, granted, they took him in the 6th round, so what does that really mean? Probably not a whole lot. But, he did not end up going this high. Carolina does end up drafting a quarterback, though. And their original pick was 9, so Vegas wasn't too far off here. But ultimately, they get Bryce Young, and I think they're all the better for it. Wish they could have had that rookie quarterback, in this case, Bryce Young, with DJ Moore, which that would have been, kind of my argument here in this video. Oh, Tanner McKee, you got DJ Moore there. There's a lot to be excited about, blah, blah, blah. Hopefully they move on from Matt Rule is probably something I'm saying in this video. But a lot of things end up breaking in a different way and arguably in a better way for Carolina. Then Jackson Smith-Njigba to Chicago. And I actually had forgotten about this. But this would have been awesome had they not gotten DJ Moore in that trade. Actually, I had a mock where they moved down from 9 and still take Jackson Smith-Njigba because I don't think Chase Claypool should let you or prevent you from making that pick if you trade down, get more picks, and still want to get better there. The fit would have made a lot of sense at the time. Pair up Ohio State wide receiver with Justin Fields made a lot of sense at the time. But again, ultimately how the offseason played out, you get that wide receiver in DJ Moore, then they draft a tackle at 10, and it feels like that environment around Justin Fields is really, really good and probably better than what it would have been had they been picking 8 and had they taken Jackson Smith-Njigba. But who knows? Free agency could have broken out in a very different way in that hypothetical situation. Then Will Levis to the Giants. Levis ends up not being a first rounder, and the Giants end up not needing a quarterback because Daniel Jones has a career year. And, the Giants were one of my favorite drafts of this 2023 NFL draft. I do think part of that is, I wasn't crazy about the Daniel Jones extension because quarterback was taken off as like a must-get priority. It allowed them to be like, hey, we need a center. Hey, we need a corner. Hey, we need a wide receiver. And they got to patch up those other holes in the roster and get really good value, specifically with those first 3 picks attacking those positions. And then you're just hoping that Daniel Jones continues from where he left off last season. So a couple things off here. And then the other note about it is the Giants were better than we thought, so they were not picking at number 9 overall. Then Washington here at 10. I give him Eli Ricks. Man, Eli Ricks did not go in the first round. Definitely had the talent and the potential, but he was really slow to get on the field at Alabama, which once we got to the beginning of the college season, it was like, okay, Eli Ricks is probably not this top 10 guy. But at the very time of this recording, he was kind of one of those early consensus top corners in the class. And Washington did end up drafting quarter. Not a corner that I was crazy about, considering Deonte Banks, Christian Gonzalez, Joey Porter Jr. were all available. But they did end up going corner, but they ended up picking a little bit later than this. So, wrong with the player almost entirely. But still, it was a position that Washington ended up addressing in the first round. So I'm not terribly far off there. Pittsburgh drafts Peter Skoronski, and we get hit with my own ad of my own video. So you're getting adception here. We'll go ahead and skip past that. Peter Skoronski, Pittsburgh, does add a tackle. And it's Broderick Jones, who I have ranked just behind Skoronski, if you're calling Skoronski a tackle, but also interior offensive line flexibility. I remember saying that at that time where it's like, who knows, maybe Dan Moore takes a step forward. I was a little optimistic about what he could be going into year 2. He didn't really take that big of a step forward, if a step forward at all. So, I was like, we need a tackle. But Skoronski could be an upgraded guard. Pittsburgh ends up signing Sam Alawu in reality. So, they ended up going a different direction here. But, the offensive line need was something that we talked about pretty much all draft cycle for Pittsburgh. So, glaring need, and I'm glad that they addressed it in the first round. And they might have taken Skoronski had he been there at 14. Then for Minnesota, the Trenton Simpson. I had this pick mocked to them in a handful of first-round mocks down the rest of the NFL draft, mock draft cycle, that is. But here at 12 was definitely rich for Simpson's blood for where he ultimately ended up going at 87, but even where he was on my big board. So, very early on, but I am glad that it's UDFA signing, but I'm glad the Vikings did add some linebacker depth and some speed with Ivan Pace Jr. He's a good Brian Flores linebacker, but I'm a little shocked they didn't add linebacker throughout the true NFL draft because they needed to get some more speed in the middle of the field, and Simpson definitely would have brought that with 4.43 speed at the combine. But this was a little early for Simpson, and ultimately Minnesota picks later than this in the NFL draft. And then we get to Philadelphia, and they did have 2 firsts here. I give them Cam Smith, who ends up going in the second round, but My thinking, of course, at the time was, Darius Slay, James Bradbury, they're getting older position, expiring contracts here in the distant future. They could address this position. And Cam Smith, and especially at that time, was very clean, was able to avoid a lot of penalty issues and things of that nature. That ultimately ended up changing a little bit in his last year at South Carolina. Had like 10 penalties last year. But yeah, still kind of interesting to look at that. But I guess I had him as corner 2 off the board, and that he was not in the real NFL draft. Then Anton Harrison to the Raiders. So again, if anything, I am consistent. I've always liked Anton Harrison, his polished pass pro technique. Here I remember saying, yeah, you'd have to flip him over to right tackle and make it work with Colton Miller, who's a good left tackle, which he may end up doing for Jacksonville. I mean, who knows what happens post Cam Robinson suspension. So I love that I had Anton Harrison as a first-round tackle, because he was indeed a first-round tackle, not this high, but he did end up being a first-rounder. And offensive line was something eventually the Raiders addressed, but not nearly as high. But throughout the draft cycle, there were plenty of people mocking, the Raiders and offensive linemen at 7. So not terribly far off. The Dolphins take Broderick Jones, and needing another tackle. Teron Armstead missed a lot of time. I remember thinking that maybe you could also move Broderick Jones over to right tackle, just like Anton Harrison. And, surprisingly enough, Miami did not address tackle throughout the entire 2023 NFL draft. So it was a big whiff there, but this ends up being 1 pick lower than where Broderick Jones actually goes, with Pittsburgh trading up to 14 to take him. So not terribly far off with where Jones ended up going, but yeah, this ended up not being a spot that Miami addressed, which to me, a little foolish, because I don't really believe in Austin Jackson, but we'll see. Maybe he takes that step forward this upcoming season. Then New England, Jordan Addison, they don't go wide receiver in the first round, but it was something that a lot of people were mocking, whether it's Jackson Smith and Jigba, Quentin Johnston, Zay Flowers, all those names were something we saw in a lot of mocks, or I mocked myself. And of course, at this time, we were like, dude, there is no long-term answer in New England right now at the wide receiver position. We were coming off of year 1 of Mac Jones, where he looked okay, tapered off towards the end, but especially after seeing year 2 for Mac Jones, that wide receiver need was only further cemented. So I'm really interested to see DeAndre Hopkins still out there. Do they make that move? Or are they just hoping Kayshon Boutte is a 6th rounder and ends up being the guy that puts them over the top there at that position? But wide receiver, they didn't really have... I don't think this year's class ultimately became worth them taking at 17. Plus, Christian Gonzalez fell into their lap. So maybe they were looking at wide receiver, but extreme value with what they got in Christian Gonzalez. Then it was the Titans here at 17. Paris Johnson Jr. Wow. So even for my very first mock, I was a knowing Tennessee Titans fan with over continuously drafting Paris Johnson Jr. to the Tennessee Titans. But hey, the fit would have made a lot of sense, and they ended up drafting Peter Skoronski. So we got the position right. They ended up picking a little bit earlier on than where they were here in this way too early mock at 17. But yeah, we actually got a guy as close as you possibly could a year in advance. And then Houston at 17, I gave him Jaquelin Roy. Again, I told y'all I thought Jaquelin Roy was going to have a freak season last year. Ultimately, he becomes a 3rd rounder to Minnesota, or 4th rounder for that matter, to Minnesota, which actually kind of like him as a plug-and-play starter there on day 3. For the Vikings in a spot where they could definitely get better. But yeah, he was not a first rounder. And Houston... did they even address interior defensive line? I don't think they did in 2023. So that's a little interesting. I guess they're going to roll out with Lopez and Malik Collins again next year, but who aren't terrible, but do feel like you could do better than both those guys. But yeah, Jaquelin Roy was not worth being a number 18 overall selection in this year's class. And Jordan Battle was worth taking at 19. Eagles do address safety at the end of the 2nd or early 3rd. Now I'm getting my pick numbers mixed up, but they draft Sidney Brown on day 2. And yeah, he ends up going before Jordan Battle, which yeah, Battle ended up kind of being still a really good football player. And I think the tape is convincing of making him a day 2 pick. But the athletic testing was better 40 than Xavier McKinney, but all his other numbers didn't really boast, making him someone who goes relatively high in the NFL draft. So unfortunate to see Battle wasn't this first round prospect, but Philadelphia does eventually address safety in the 2023 draft. And then for the Ravens, Brian Brzee. So I always kind of saw him as this first round guy. He kind of fluctuated as a guy who maybe could go top 10. There's someone who ends up going a whole lot later than that, but 29 to 20, not terribly far off. And it wasn't out of the realm of possibility the Ravens took a defensive interior guy to partner up with Travis Jones, who they took in the 3rd round last draft. So, and I even had mocks and reacted to mocks with Brzee going to the Ravens. So it wasn't out of the realm of possibilities, but they ended up going wide receiver in the 1st round instead of defensive interior. Myles Murphy's the next pick. So, another Clemson guy that I thought should go in the 1st round. Again, Could have gone top 10 really, really early on in this process, but instead goes 28. So we actually got even closer with where I mocked him in this way too early mock versus where he ended up going. And for Arizona, they pick a whole hell of a lot earlier than they did here at 21. Did not end up being, playoff competitive. Instead held the number 3 overall pick. But they had an awesome draft, and I know a lot of Cardinals fans wish they were picking at 21. They pick at 3, they move back, get to 6, get Paris Johnson Jr., and ultimately accumulate a ton of 2024 draft capital. And I think Monty Austin-Forth has his team heading in the right direction. And if I'm a Cardinals fan, it's night and day between him and Steve Keim. Then for Seattle, their second first-rounder, Tyler Van Dyke. Seattle did not add a starting replacement to Geno Smith because Geno Smith ended up being pretty solid and garnered a long-term extension. At this time, Geno Smith, Drew Lock, that's the quarterback room, and nobody really had a whole lot of faith in either one of those guys. So we were mocking quarterbacks, and Tyler Van Dyke didn't even come out this year. So pretty big misfire there. But it is interesting. This is the pick from Denver, which you can see very small on your screen there. They end up truly picking at 20. So, not too far off where Vegas thought Denver might end up being. So that's, again, kind of fun to look at and analyze. So then it's on to the Chargers, and Noah Sewell ended up being a day 3 pick. I liked him a lot early on in the process, but then once we got into the college football season, I was like, yeah, okay, he's not really adding a whole lot more to his game. And honestly, the athletic testing, he's not as flashy as maybe sometimes he looks. And the Chargers do add a linebacker in the top 100. Deion Henley was a guy that we weren't really talking about this part of the draft, but great coverage specialist, which makes for a really good fit. And honestly, I don't really know how Noah Sewell was going to fit into it, considering his best and first and foremost calling card is really being a blitzer and a guy who wins creating pressure right up the middle. They really don't have a need for that in that defense. So that was a little bit of a head scratcher even in retrospect. But again, the whole point of this is really to talk about prospects who could go round 1. And Nolan Smith did indeed go round 1. Went later than this, but I think that was a mistake on the NFL's part and just kind of giving that much more of a win and letting the rich get richer in Philadelphia. So fantastic pick by the Eagles. And him going to the Dolphins, I remember saying, hey, Jalen Phillips, I liked him a lot as edge 1, but that was a weaker edge group. No guarantee he hits. And also at the time, Miami didn't have Bradley Chubb. So you could also have sold me on Nolan Smith plus Jalen Phillips as that edge tandem of the future. Edge ended up not being something they addressed, but I do love the first 2 picks that Miami made this NFL draft. Then Josh Downs to the Colts, which, hey, he did end up becoming an Indianapolis Colts just about 2 rounds later. So missed it by that much. But to me, honestly, Downs, I wouldn't have been totally floored if he went late 1. To me, should have been a second rounder. I was thinking he might go 42, 45 to Green Bay. Instead, falls into the 3rd round. And the Colts, I think, got a starter there in the slot over Isaiah McKenzie. At the minimum, it's going to be a competition between McKenzie and Downs for that 3rd wide receiver role. Then Antonio Johnson to Dallas. Yeah, I thought he should have been a day 2 pick, but he ends up going in the 3rd round, one of the most valuable day 3 picks added to the Jags, who I think immediately have Antonio Johnson's that nickel corner strong safety hybrid, which kind of fills 2 shoes at once. And Dallas at the time, I was like, yeah, they could use a safety. They could kind of use a nickel long term, upgrade over, Jordan Lewis and Anthony Brown, some of the guys they've been playing there. But yeah, this Dallas team looks a whole lot different now versus when it did, a year or so ago. And even just like, Kellen Moore not being there anymore. Now that's Brian Schottenheimer and it's Mike McCarthy calling. But, so even organizationally, this team looks a whole lot different than they did at this time. But Antonio Johnson would have been kind of cool to keep him in state, but yeah, no, he goes a lot lower than this. And then Andre Carter, you want to talk about going lower than this. Cincinnati ends up picking a pick later than this, so Vegas pretty much spot on here. And they did go edge. It was just Miles Murphy, freaky athlete. Andre Carter goes undrafted and then signs with the Vikings as a UDFA. So good ad for Minnesota, especially when it's not a draft pick. I think that's worth while taking on. Just let that guy transform his body into a full-time football player as opposed to part-time football player, part-time, Army cadet. So we'll see. Untapped potential to be mined there. But yeah, it was not a first rounder. But there are a lot of people like myself really excited about what Andre Carter could do because you saw a lot of the traits and explosiveness 2 years ago, albeit at an academy school. But there felt like there was something to grow into there for Carter. But yeah, unfortunately, he did not hit that potential this past season. And then the Lions' second pick, Tony Grimes. Yeah, this guy was not a first rounder, simply put. And corner did end up being something that was talked about pretty heavily for Detroit, especially after they traded Jeff Okudah. So I had the right position in mind. And it's also comical. Vegas thought the Rams were going to be picking 28, which, hey, they were the reigning Super Bowl champs, but it's just with hindsight, with how much the season really took a downswing, or downturn, really from week 1 onward. It is kind of funny to look at what the expectations were for the Rams versus where they ended up picking. But yeah, Tony Grimes was not a first rounder. So kind of had the position right, but the pick ended up being drastically different. And yeah, it was definitely not Tony Grimes. And then Green Bay, Michael Mayer. This was one that we saw in a whole lot of early mocks. But, Brian Gutekunst being Brian Gutekunst, they don't draft pass catchers in the first round, even if it is all the way down at like 29. They just aren't going to do that. Mayer would have been a good fit, but I almost got the value right. 29, he ends up going 35 to the Vikings, or excuse me, the Raiders. 35, 36. I can't remember exactly what the trade up was for, but not too far off with the value. And second tight end off the board. I had him here as the first tight end, so not terribly far off in that realm either. And then, the other, I guess, interesting point here is there's 32 picks in the first round. Of course, you ended up only getting 31, so that's a little funny to look back at. Shout out to the tampering the Miami Dolphins did. Made it one less pick there in the first round, pushing even more talent into the second. Chiefs take Kelee Ringo. I even said if they took him at 30 at points of this cycle, I was like, I don't hate that value, but then he really started to cool off and ultimately became a fifth rounder. So to me, it should have been that, day 2, kind of second round territory, late 2, maybe early 3. So I think the Eagles got supreme value with where they got Ringo, but there were plenty of times where we thought he could be a first rounder. Then it kind of moved into the 20s and then maybe very late 1 to early 2. And then ultimately, yeah, like I said, late 2, early 3. And he would have been like a Spagnuolo type of corner, but Trent McDuffie's there and some of the other corners already in place, and they don't really put a whole lot of value necessarily into it, like free agency dollars and high draft capital, and they just find guys that do what Spags needs, and they kind of live off of those day 3 picks like a Watson and company, with the exception of Trent McDuffie, kind of, I think, long-term being that Honey Badger-esque type of player. And then Tampa Bay, who did not end up picking 31, instead making it into the playoffs with a sub-500 record, gave him Bijan Robinson. He ends up going 23 picks higher than this, but was RB1 off the board in a freak talent. I remember saying in this mock, like, he's a freak talent, could go a whole lot higher, but it's just hard to grade where running back's going to go, which I think I said approximately, 2.5 million other times this draft cycle. So yeah, that was a true mock draft type of move, and especially with other mocks throughout the cycle. Sometimes here at 31, it was the Eagles, it was the Bills, with the season and the records changing and the draft picks changing, of course, with it. There were a lot of times where the second to last pick in a mock was Bijan Robinson, just because it was like, hey, we don't know where he's going to go, and this team could maybe use an upgrade at running back. So starting from the jump, we were saying that pretty much for Bijan. And then at pick 32, the Bills, I guess, were the preseason Super Bowl favorites, and let's see. Who did I end up taking here? Man, I am making myself work. I didn't scroll down. God. I was an even worse YouTuber than I am now. Now you can kind of see at the very bottom of the screen, that's Zion Nelson, who was not a first rounder, but I did like a lot. As a prospect tight end, converted to tackles, kind of gotten better year over year at Miami, has good athletic traits, but yeah, was not in the first round this past year. And the Bills, not terribly far off Vegas-wise for where they ended up picking, but they did not win the Super Bowl, so they were not picking at number 32. But they do add offensive line, interior offensive line, not tackle. But I still think tackle could have been something they added. And if maybe the value was right for some of those guys, it could have been something that they did address. But man, this was always kind of a fun video to look at. I was obviously wrong on a ton of these picks, and so was Vegas. So we're just wrong in general, and that's why predicting something a year in advance is something that I wouldn't advise you to do. I would try to do it as late as you possibly could. So, but that's the fun of it. That's the NFL draft cycle. So tomorrow, again, is going to be my way too early 2024 mock draft, and I can't wait to be wrong on just about every pick as well, all over again. But hopefully you guys enjoyed. Hit that like button if you did. Subscribe if you're new, and comment your thoughts. What pick do you think was the funniest to look back at in retrospect? Player or maybe team positioning. I'd love to hear your thoughts down below in the comment section. But that is going to do it for me. Hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. And until next time, my name is Teach, and I am signing off.